They shamed her for serving tables, without knowing she was about to teach them what real class means. The red wine splashed across Grace Miller's white dress, blooming like blood on snow. For a second, the ballroom froze. Then came the laugh, a sharp, polite little sound that cut deeper than any insult. Evelyn Carrington tilted her head, pretending surprise. "Oh dear, such clumsiness. Maybe next time try not to stand so close." Her voice was sugar and poison mixed in one. The guests exchanged awkward glances. No one spoke. The string quartet kept playing, as if silence could erase cruelty. Grace looked down at her soaked dress. Her heart pounded, but her face stayed calm. She picked up the broken glass carefully, whispering, "I'll take care of it, ma'am." Not a tremor, not a tear, just quiet dignity that made Evelyn's smile tighten. They tried to break her in public, but stay, because before the night ends, the whole room will learn what real strength looks like. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, voice raised just enough to be heard across the table. "What a pity," she said, every word dripping with condescension. "Some people just don't know how to behave in civilized places." The laughter that followed was soft but sharp. Patricia Langley, seated beside her, let out a polite chuckle. "Bless her heart," she murmured, pretending sympathy while feeding the cruelty. All eyes turned toward Grace. She could feel them. The pity, the judgment, the silent delight of people who enjoyed watching others shrink. Her fingers trembled for a second, then steadied. She knelt to gather the shattered glass, her movements quiet and precise. The quartet hesitated, one violin note hanging awkwardly in the air. Then the music resumed, pretending nothing had happened. Grace stood, her dress stained, her pride untouched. Evelyn smiled, pleased with her own performance. But behind that smile, a seed of unease began to grow. The music swelled again, covering the low hum of gossip. "She probably works for tips," a woman whispered. "Why do they let this kind in?" Another murmured, sipping her champagne as if cruelty were routine. The words stung, each one slicing deeper than the wine stain ever could. Grace kept her head down, moving from table to table, her face calm, her pulse racing. From the head table, Charles Carrington watched, his brow furrowed, jaw tight. He had seen arrogance before, in business meetings, boardrooms, even in his own reflection. But tonight it looked uglier than ever. He didn't speak. He simply observed, memorizing the tone of every whisper, the smirk on his wife's lips. Something inside him shifted, a quiet recognition that dignity, not wealth, defined real class. Grace returned to Evelyn's table, holding a fresh napkin and a calm she didn't feel. "I'll make sure it's cleaned up properly, ma'am," she said softly. Her tone was even, her words measured, the kind of politeness that left no room for pity. Evelyn blinked, caught off guard. She had expected tears, maybe a trembling apology. Instead, she got composure. That serenity irritated her more than any outburst could have. "See that you do," Evelyn snapped, turning back to her friends, though her laughter sounded forced. Grace nodded and stepped away. Inside, her hands ached from gripping the tray too tight, but she didn't let them see. She'd learned long ago that control was its own kind of power. Sometimes strength isn't about fighting back, it's about refusing to fall apart when the world wants you to. As Grace walked toward the kitchen, she felt a gaze follow her. She turned slightly and met Charles Carrington's eyes. He didn't look away. There was no pity there, only curiosity. And something else. Respect. For a heartbeat, the chaos of the ballroom faded. Two people, worlds apart, recognized each other in silence, one stripped of privilege, one finally seeing truth. Grace lowered her eyes and kept walking, her heart steady now. Behind her, Charles leaned back in his chair, watching his wife's laughter echo through the hall. He realized the cruelest noise in the room wasn't the gossip. It was his own silence. And in that moment, he decided to start paying attention. She disappeared behind the swinging door, carrying not just a tray, but the weight of every stare that had followed her. Grace leaned against the wall, her breathing uneven. The hum of the ballroom filtered through the heavy door. Laughter, glass clinking, violins pretending nothing had happened. Her hands shook. She pressed them against her apron, forcing herself to stay steady. "Don't cry," she whispered under her breath. "Not here." She had promised herself long ago that tears would never be a weapon used against her. She glanced at her wristwatch, the small silver one clipped to her apron strap. It looked ordinary, but inside was a tiny recorder, a habit she'd formed while researching for her thesis at Columbia. Every word, every slur, every laugh was there, captured in digital clarity. She exhaled slowly, grounding herself. That recording wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. And tonight, truth had shown its face. A voice shouted from the hall, calling for more towels. Grace straightened, adjusted her bun, and forced her lips into a calm smile. She opened the kitchen door. If they wanted to humiliate her again, they'd have to do it to someone who refused to break twice. Grace stepped back into the golden light of the ballroom. Evelyn Carrington's laughter filled the air, polished, artificial, and cruel. "They really should hire people who understand refinement," she said to her circle of friends. "Some people just don't belong in certain rooms." Patricia Langley giggled. "Darling, you always know how to say what we're all thinking." Grace approached quietly with a clean towel and a fresh tray. Every step felt heavier, yet her face stayed composed. The whispers returned, softer this time, sharper in meaning. Evelyn turned toward her again, the kind of smile that meant trouble. "Well, look who's back," she said, voice bright but cutting. "Ready to try again, sweetheart?" Grace simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am." No sarcasm, no fear, just patience, and something unshakable beneath it. Evelyn's grin faltered for a heartbeat. Power was no fun when the other person refused to play along. Evelyn lifted the event's printed menu, the edges gold-embossed. "Since you're so confident," she said loudly, "maybe you can read this aloud for us." The group exchanged amused glances. Patricia hid her smirk behind a glass of wine. "Oh, this should be good." Grace paused, tray balanced perfectly in one hand. She understood the trap. The menu filled with French words chosen to trip her tongue, designed to turn dignity into spectacle. But humiliation only works if you let it. She set the tray down, straightened her shoulders, and took the card from Evelyn's hand. "Would you like me to start from the top, ma'am?" Evelyn leaned back. "If you can." The music softened. A hush rippled through the nearby tables. Everyone waited for the waitress to stumble. Grace smiled slightly, her eyes calm. "With pleasure, ma'am." Grace began to read. "Amuse-bouche de crevettes au champagne, suivi par le potage parmentier aux truffes noires du Périgord." Her French rolled smooth and confident, each word perfectly pronounced. The laughter faded. By the time she finished the first course, Evelyn's face had lost its color. Grace continued, voice steady, unhurried. The accent flawless, the diction elegant. Even the violinist stopped to listen. When she reached the final line, she lowered the card and met Evelyn's eyes. "I hope that was clear enough for your guests, ma'am." The silence that followed was thick and deafening. Evelyn's friends avoided her gaze, fidgeting with their glasses. Grace placed the menu gently on the table and stepped back. Humiliation had changed hands, quietly, gracefully. No shouting, no triumph, just truth. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the music hesitated. Charles Carrington rose slowly from his chair, breaking the spell. "Perhaps we should focus on the charity itself," he said, his tone calm but weighted. The crowd exhaled as if released from invisible chains. A few guests nodded, others looked away, embarrassed by their own silence. Evelyn tried to laugh it off, but her voice cracked. "Of course, dear. Just having a little fun." Grace turned, walking toward the back of the room. The wine stain on her dress had dried dark, but her composure gleamed brighter than any crystal in that hall. Charles's gaze followed her until she disappeared through the service door. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, his wife's cruelty or that young woman's unshakable grace. Some truths, once seen, can't be unseen. The tension melted, but the damage was done. In that silence, something irreversible had shifted. Grace turned away from the table, her pulse still racing. She didn't smile, not fully, just a small curve at the corner of her lips. It wasn't pride. It was relief. She hadn't raised her voice or returned a single insult. She had simply let truth do the talking. Behind her, Evelyn Carrington tried to recover her dignity, laughing too loudly, waving for the waiter to refill her glass. No one met her eyes. The women who'd been whispering a moment ago now pretended to be fascinated by their desserts. Grace walked calmly toward the kitchen, her shoulders straight. The echo of her heels against the marble floor felt like a quiet victory drum. Every step said what she didn't need to say aloud. "You didn't break me." She pushed through the kitchen doors, the laughter fading behind her. For the first time that night, she let herself breathe. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't revenge at all. It's walking away with your dignity untouched, while the other side drowns in their own noise. Steam and chatter filled the kitchen. Dishes clattered, waiters rushed past. Grace slipped into a corner, pulling off her gloves. Her hands were still trembling, but this time from adrenaline, not fear. She reached for her apron strap and unclipped the small recorder hidden there. A red light blinked softly. She pressed play and listened to a few seconds. The laughter, the words, Evelyn's voice as sharp as broken glass. 23 minutes, she whispered, crystal clear. It wasn't about exposing anyone yet. It was about having proof, about knowing she wasn't crazy for feeling the weight of those words. She placed the recorder in her bag, staring at her reflection in the metal refrigerator door. The same woman, but somehow different now. Tonight had drawn a line she could never step back over. Grace took a deep breath, tied her apron again, and returned to work, quietly, steadily, carrying a secret that could change everything. The night was almost over when a soft knock came at the service door. "Miss Miller?" a man's voice said. "May I have a word?" Grace turned. Charles Carrington stood there, hands clasped in front of him, his tuxedo slightly rumpled. He looked nothing like the powerful figure from the head table. She hesitated, unsure what to expect. "Yes, sir?" He lowered his voice. "I just wanted to speak with you privately, away from all that." Grace nodded and followed him into the quiet hallway. The air smelled faintly of wine and roses from the gala. For the first time that night she felt seen, not as a waitress, not as a symbol, but as a person. Charles looked uneasy. "I need to say something," he began, his tone low and heavy. She waited, her eyes steady. The moment stretched, fragile but real. The first thread of a conversation neither of them had planned for. "There's no excuse for what I witnessed tonight," Charles said finally. His voice was firm, but regret lived in every syllable. "My wife's behavior was disgraceful." Grace folded her hands in front of her, the recorder's weight still hidden in her pocket. "You don't owe me an apology for her choices, Mr. Carrington." He frowned slightly. "Maybe not, but silence makes you part of it, and I've been silent for too long." Grace studied him for a moment. He wasn't like the others, no false sympathy, no superiority, just honesty. That alone earned a measure of her respect. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, still looking unsettled. "You handled yourself with more grace than anyone in that room, including me." She almost smiled at the irony of her name. "Sometimes," she said softly, "that's all a person can do." Charles hesitated, searching her expression. "You're not really a waitress, are you?" Grace tilted her head slightly. "What makes you say that?" "The way you carry yourself, the way you spoke. You reminded me of someone who doesn't belong behind a tray." She took a breath. "I'm an MBA student at Columbia," she said. "I work events like this to help my family and pay tuition." Charles blinked. "Columbia? My God!" He rubbed the bridge of his nose, processing the reality. "So, my wife publicly humiliated a graduate student studying at one of the best business schools in the country." "It happens more often than you'd think," Grace replied quietly. "People see the uniform and decide who you are." He met her gaze. Then maybe it's time someone changed that. Grace didn't answer, but for the first time that night she felt the shift. Respect, possibility, and a spark of justice waiting to be lit. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The air between them carried something unspoken. Respect, maybe even regret. Charles stood silent for a long moment, hands folded loosely in front of him. Then his voice softened. "Come work with me," he said. "Audit my company's culture. I need real change, not the kind they put on paper for PR." Grace blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Work with you?" "Yes," he said simply. "Hartwell, no. Carrington Estates is successful because it builds homes. But lately, I'm realizing we've forgotten the people who live inside them." Grace hesitated, her mind racing. This man, her tormentor's husband, was offering her a professional opportunity she'd never imagined. Was it guilt, or was it genuine belief in her worth? "I'm honored," she said carefully, "but I'm still a student. I'm finishing my MBA." "Even better," Charles said. "You see things others ignore. That's exactly what I need." Grace looked at him, searching for insincerity and finding none. For the first time that night she felt something unexpected. Hope. But before she could answer, the sharp click of heels echoed down the hallway. "Charles?" Evelyn's voice sliced through the air like ice. "What on earth are you doing with her?" Her tone carried both shock and fury, the kind only power mixed with fear can create. She looked from him to Grace, disbelief twisting her elegant face. Charles straightened. "Offering her a position," he said evenly. "Our company needs someone who understands the culture we pretend to have." Evelyn's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. She's a waitress, for God's sake." Grace stayed silent. There was no point in arguing with someone who only saw uniforms, not people. Charles's gaze hardened. "She's also an MBA candidate from Columbia, something you'd know if you'd asked before humiliating her." For once, Evelyn had no ready comeback. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Grace watched the exchange quietly, realizing that power wasn't about who spoke loudest. It was about who made others stop talking. Evelyn forced a thin smile, trying to recover her poise. "Let's just forget tonight, darling," she said. "We've all had too much champagne." Grace tilted her head, voice calm but sharp enough to slice through the air. "That might be difficult," she said softly. "Everything was documented." Evelyn froze. "Documented?" Grace didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough. Charles's eyes flicked between them, understanding dawning. "You recorded it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Grace didn't answer. The small pause confirmed everything. Evelyn's painted smile faltered. She clutched her clutch bag tighter, knuckles whitening. You can't use that." Grace looked her straight in the eye. "I don't need to use anything. The truth tends to find its way out." The tension hung thick, unmoving. For the first time that evening, Evelyn Carrington looked afraid, not of scandal, but of being seen for who she really was. Grace turned away, the faintest echo of strength in her quiet steps. The city of Charleston woke to a headline that burned across every feed and front page. "Audio leaks from Heritage Gala. Racist outburst exposed." Radio hosts dissected every word. Talk shows replayed the 23-minute clip on loop. Evelyn Carrington's voice was unmistakable, calm, condescending, cruel. Clips of the gala flooded social media. Hashtags trended. The Carrington name, once tied to elegance, now whispered of hypocrisy. Grace sat at a cafe near campus, her phone vibrating with messages. Friends, professors, even strangers were reaching out, some in outrage, others in admiration. She didn't smile. It wasn't triumph she felt, it was relief. Justice had a sound now, and it was crystal clear. Across town, Evelyn stared at her phone, trembling. Calls from sponsors, friends, and clubs filled her screen, but none to offer comfort. She had wanted everyone to look at her. Now, they couldn't look away. By noon, Charleston's elite began to turn on her. The Heritage Club revoked her membership. Charity boards issued statements condemning her unacceptable remarks. The same women who had laughed beside her now blocked her number. Patricia Langley sent one final text. "It's best if we don't speak for a while." Evelyn's hands shook as she scrolled through the headlines. Disgraced socialite. Audio exposes gala racism. Her phone rang endlessly. Her PR agent, lawyers, her husband. But she couldn't bring herself to answer. At the Carrington estate, Charles sat at the breakfast table, coffee untouched. When Evelyn finally entered, her eyes were swollen from a night without sleep. "You have to fix this," she said. "Tell them it's fake. Sue that woman." Charles didn't look up from the newspaper. "That woman," he said evenly, "is now our new consultant." The cup in her hand rattled against the saucer. The sound was small, but it was the sound of her world beginning to crack. The morning light cut through the marble kitchen like a blade. Evelyn paced the floor, her phone pressed to her ear, demanding answers from anyone who would still take her call. Every line went dead. Finally, she turned to her husband. "Charles, do something," she shouted. "You have to fix this. Make her stop. That girl is ruining us." Charles folded his newspaper calmly. The front page carried her face beneath the headline, "Socialite Exposed in Viral Audio." He looked up, voice low but firm. "That waitress," he said, "is now our consultant." Evelyn froze. "You hired her?" "She starts tomorrow," he replied. "And after hearing what you said, I can't think of anyone better to teach us about dignity." The silence that followed was louder than her screams. Evelyn's world, built on status, influence, and appearances, collapsed in the echo of one sentence. Charles left the room, leaving her alone with the sound of her own breath. The glass doors of Carrington Estates glimmered in the morning sun as Grace walked through them, her posture steady, her heart calm. Eyes followed her from every corner. Employees whispered. They all knew her story, the viral clip, the humiliation, the justice that followed. Charles met her in the lobby. "Welcome, Ms. Miller," he said. "I'm grateful you accepted." "I'm not here for revenge," she replied quietly. "I'm here for results." Her words carried no anger, only purpose. She had traded her apron for a blazer, but not her humility. Grace spent the day listening, asking questions, observing the culture she'd been hired to change. Some staff avoided her eyes, others smiled in silent support. By sunset, she stood by the window of her new office, looking out over the city. The same city that once watched her be humiliated now waited to see what she would build. While Grace began anew, Evelyn Carrington's empire of social circles crumbled. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. News outlets, charity boards, acquaintances asking for comment, not comfort. One by one, her memberships disappeared. The Heritage Foundation revoked her vice presidency. The Garden Society politely requested her resignation. Even her favorite boutique emailed to cancel her private fittings. She scrolled through social media, watching her followers vanish in real time. The comments were merciless. Rich doesn't mean right. Now she knows what shame feels like. Her closest ally, Patricia Langley, didn't answer her calls. When she finally texted, it was brief. "We have to protect our image. I hope you understand." Evelyn didn't respond. For the first time in years, no one cared what she said. Her reflection in the mirror looked older, smaller. Reputation had been her crown, and now it lay shattered at her feet. That evening, Charles came upstairs with a quiet heaviness that Evelyn had never seen before. He stood in the doorway, suitcase half-zipped, tie loosened. "Because of a waitress?" Evelyn's voice cracked. "You're ending 23 years because of her?" Charles paused. "No," he said softly, "because of 23 years of cruelty." She tried to laugh, but the sound died in her throat. "You can't be serious." He met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "You humiliated someone out of pure prejudice. You made me watch it, and for years I excused it. I won't do that anymore." He zipped the suitcase, the sound final, absolute. "The lawyers will handle everything," he added. "The house is yours. I'm done." When the door shut behind him, the echo filled every corner of the room, louder than her sobs. Days passed. The mansion was silent now. No ringing phones, no footsteps on marble floors, no friends coming for tea. Evelyn sat at her vanity, staring into the mirror. The woman staring back looked like a ghost of the one who once ruled every room she entered. Her makeup was gone, her hands trembled as she brushed her hair. She scrolled through old photos, galas, luncheons, magazine covers, and realized she couldn't find one where her smile looked real. Outside, the garden was overgrown. The house staff had left. The world had moved on. For the first time, she felt the weight of silence not as peace, but as punishment. The woman who once believed she owned the world was finally learning what it meant to have nothing. But somewhere beyond those silent walls, another life was already rising, quietly but unstoppable. Months passed, and Grace Miller's name began to appear in business journals and conference programs. What had started as a consulting project grew into a movement inside Carrington Estates. Employees who once stayed silent now spoke openly. Diversity programs were no longer decoration. They became company policy. Charles often said that Grace changed the company, but the truth was simpler. She reminded people what integrity looked like. Her story spread through the city and across the country. News outlets called her the woman who turned humiliation into purpose. Everywhere she went, people wanted to thank her. But Grace never saw herself as a symbol. She still took the subway, still sent part of her paycheck home to her mother. Success hadn't changed her. It had revealed who she already was. One afternoon, as she walked through the renovated Carrington lobby, she passed a young intern. The girl smiled nervously and whispered, "You're the reason I applied here." Grace smiled back, realizing her greatest victory wasn't revenge. It was opening a door that others could now walk through. Charles Carrington stepped away from the boardroom spotlight. The scandal had stripped him of illusions he hadn't even known he carried. For years, he'd built towers and estates, but never thought about the people inside them. Now, he spent his mornings drafting a new foundation plan, a scholarship fund for minority students. He called it the Grace Initiative. Half of his fortune went into it without hesitation. At the press announcement, reporters asked why. Charles looked at them and said simply, "Because success means nothing if it isn't shared. I spent decades building wealth. Now, I'd like to build something that actually matters." He donated his private art collection, sold his yacht, and funded programs that gave others the chance Grace once fought for alone. That night, he wrote her a short letter. "Thank you for reminding me that doing right isn't charity. It's responsibility." Grace never replied, but she kept the letter folded in her desk drawer. Spring arrived with clear skies and quiet pride. On the Columbia University stage, Grace stood in her navy gown, gold cords draped over her shoulders. The audience rose to their feet as her name was called. When it was her turn to speak, she looked across the hall, hundreds of students, professors, and families watching. She took a steady breath. "Don't let prejudice decide your worth," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "Let your success speak louder. Let your kindness speak even louder than that." The applause began softly, then grew into a standing ovation. Somewhere near the back, Charles watched silently, proud but distant, knowing she no longer needed anyone to stand beside her. For Grace, the moment wasn't about victory. It was about closure, the quiet kind that lives in knowing you've become everything they said you couldn't be. As she walked off the stage, the past finally stopped following her. Under Grace's leadership, Carrington Estates transformed. Its diversity programs became a model studied at universities. Profits grew, but so did its conscience. At business schools across the country, case studies began with the same headline: "From Scandal to Reform, the Carrington Transformation." Grace's name became synonymous with resilience. Meanwhile, Evelyn lived alone in the mansion that once defined her worth. Curtains drawn, phone silent, her name now served as a cautionary tale in ethics seminars. Professors played the viral recording, pausing between lines to discuss the cost of arrogance. Grace never mentioned her again. She didn't need to. The world had already decided who Evelyn Carrington was and what Grace Miller had become. The story had outgrown both of them, turning pain into education, humiliation into history. They shamed her for serving tables, but she ended up serving justice. Grace now led projects across the country, advising corporations on inclusion and ethics. Her journey from waitress to leader became more than a story. It became a reminder. True class had nothing to do with money, power, or last names. It lived in how one person treated another when no one else was watching. When reporters asked her what drove her, she always gave the same answer: dignity. It's the one thing no one can give you, and no one can take away. She smiled then, her voice calm but sure. True class can't be bought. It's earned by character. If you believe dignity is real power, stay. There are more stories like this, about ordinary people who teach the world what grace truly means.